tonight.
What is the biggest lesson Caribbean leadership should have learned that emerged out of the COVID-19 pandemic?
A conversation on the Caribbean and the need for policy change.
Well, there is a sort of standstill position in terms of where do we go from here.
Now, on CNC3, Winston Dookeran.
Mr. Winston Dookeran, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
You've edited and basically co-authored a book, Resetting Caribbean Policy Analysis in the Aftermath of the COVID-19 Pandemic. And this book seeks to be a guiding light for the Caribbean in a post-pandemic world. What motivated you to write, to co-author, and ultimately edit this book?
Well, I felt there was a vacuum in the reading public with respect to policy issues, and particularly with respect to the post-COVID era. And I thought the time had come where we can try and assess what are likely to be the new policies for the future.
How important are new policies for the future, given what we've seen the Caribbean go through and Caribbean leadership face during the pandemic?
Well, I think we are at a moment in our history, not only in the Caribbean, but worldwide, where there are many different trends and changes taking place. And therefore, new policies really are on the agenda everywhere.
Do you fear that the Caribbean has been lagging too far behind international policies, international best practices, international standards with regards to different sectors and scenarios?
Well, the Caribbean has been on a policy standstill.
You called it stagnant in the book.
Perhaps, yes. And that standstill is where we are today, and the need to reassess and reset the policy directions is what I believe is the requirement of today's world.
How much did that standstill, let's use your words today, how much did that standstill policy affect the Caribbean's ability and Caribbean leadership's ability to respond effectively enough to the COVID-19 pandemic?
Well, to some extent, it did respond very effectively to the COVID-19 pandemic, but not in terms of the long-term impact that this would have had on the policy changes for the future. And this is what this book is all about.
So tell us a little bit about your findings in this book, Resetting Caribbean Policy Analysis in the Aftermath of the Pandemic.
Well, I think in the first instance, there is the global dimension. Has changed fundamentally. It didn't start with COVID-19, it started before that. And now we are facing a situation where we are in a multipolar world. And as we see happening in the world around us, many of our global institutions are under political stress and not being able to handle some of the global issues. So the book deals with the global response to the global problems and the Caribbean reaction to it.
And the Caribbean in the book you would have mentioned, or that you've co-authored obviously, that the Caribbean has been at a policy standstill for quite some time.
Well, it has been an evolution, and we are at a turning point at this point in time. And during this turning point, we are not quite sure in what direction we should go, whether we apply that to the global situation, or we apply it to the regional situation, or definitely if we apply it to the national situation.
And of course the possibility exists at this turning point that we could keep turning around in circles.
Well, hopefully this is why we need policy analysis, so that we do not end up doing the same thing that we have done in the past and call it new.
What is the biggest lesson Caribbean leadership should have learned that emerged out of the COVID-19 pandemic?
Well, we should be prepared for any catastrophe of a global nature, and we should be in a position where we can react with a certain amount of urgency. So our survival depends on our sustainability to response.
So, but you just mentioned that the Caribbean leadership did not do very badly in its response to the COVID-19 pandemic. What are those boxes that we now need to tick to be able to confront, not probably the next pandemic, but the next global issue?
Well, I think essentially what was discussed in this book were two fundamental areas. One is in the health sector and the ability to respond more effectively to health challenges we are facing. And what we could learn from the experience is how do we respond to that in a more positive way on a sustainable basis as opposed to a survival basis.
Given your research, what were the pros and cons of the Caribbean's response to the COVID-19 pandemic?
I think on the positive side that we are able to handle the situation rather quickly, but we were not able to get a quick start to the solution. And there were some delays at the very beginning that cost us some lives. We should have been anticipated and be ready for that. The diplomatic work that was necessary perhaps was not done in time. But having got over that earlier hiccup, we responded very well. But beyond that now is the issue of what do you do with health policy in the future.
But Mr. Dookeran, you say the diplomatic work perhaps was not done, early enough or fast enough. But the fact is, if we go back to the pandemic, in the early days of that pandemic, when thousands of people were dying across the world each day, a lot of countries started to box themselves in. Those, with the vaccine, didn't want to export it. Those with food security didn't want to export it. It became a very nationalistic approach. So I'm not sure how, I say all of that to say I'm not sure how much diplomacy would have actually worked in those early days of the pandemic. Which brings me to the question and the point that I'd like to draw to you. How important is it then that the Caribbean begins to, and I know that you're going to point to the book here, but how important is it then that the Caribbean puts itself in a position where it's able to respond as a region to such crises and circumstances without having to depend on the international community when the international community decides that it wants to help itself?
Well, on a regional basis, there was need to have more clout in terms of dealing with the capitals of the world. Dealing with them bilaterally made it a little difficult to get immediate action. And therefore, it could have been better if we had a regional response.
What are the contents and why do you consider it important for the Caribbean public to consume the text that you've edited and authored in this book?
Well, the primary public that will be interested in what is in this book will be the policymakers and those who are actually doing policy work and those who will influence policy work. And to do that, there will be the students of politics and the students of economics and the students of diplomacy who will have to look at the methodology that will be required in order to do new policy work. And those are the primary public for this book.
Still to come, the Caribbean is playing catch-up with the rest of the world.
Well, there is a sort of standstill position in terms of when do we go from here.
The template of the book, you've found it necessary to break down into 3 dimensions: global, regional, and then national. Why?
Well, as I indicated, there are global challenges that are sometimes outside our immediate control, but which we have to negotiate. And therefore, the diplomacy required to so do becomes an important issue. But in the region, there is a need to set up the right institutions in order to be able to deal with the collective response that is required. For instance, the Caribbean integration process. And the book talks about the fact that the Caribbean integration process has reached its limits, and perhaps it needs to get a redesign of it and to include in it convergence spaces within the Caribbean, and to broaden the scope of activities in order to be able to give it a higher level of activity.
Let's talk a little bit about that. That's an important point. What does that redesign look like?
Well, the redesign is we have a good example with the Eastern Caribbean Currency Board in terms of cooperation across countries on monetary policy. We also have a good example with respect to the Pacific Alliance, which is a group of countries in Latin America in which Trinidad and Tobago is indeed an observer country, in which they have convergence with respect to private sector initiatives and the flow of funds. The institutions to encourage the flow of funds needs to be addressed to give it ease with which it can happen.
All right, so you talk about the need for greater Caribbean integration going into the future. How key will that Caribbean integration, that regional integration in the Caribbean be to address the challenges brought on by crises like the pandemic?
Well, in the first instance, there was the issue of the high energy diplomacy that was required. But more important to that is the whole transformation of the health sector and the voice of the Caribbean in the WHO. These are some of the issues that could be dealt with which resulted from the pandemic. The book is not about the pandemic. The book is about the policy in the aftermath of the pandemic.
And what should that policy look like when you talk about, because I'm getting that you're talking about a more regional approach to health in the Caribbean, that could confront the challenges more regionally as opposed to nationally.
I think the regional dimension is always important, but it's not a substitute to national initiatives, and they must work in a synchronized way. It's not that you do regional approach as opposed to national approach.
But part of the challenge with the Caribbean right now is that the regional integration of the Caribbean, of the movement that leadership would like to see. You were a Minister of Foreign Affairs as well, that you would have worked for in your time as a Minister of Foreign Affairs in Trinidad and Tobago. Is that stalled?
Well, there is a sort of standstill position in terms of where do we go from here. And to some extent the book addresses some of the concerns of this standstill position and how do you change it. I think on the question of health sector reform, we are tied in very much with what has happened in the global environment with the SIDS countries of the world.
But let's talk about that. How do we change that? How do we get to the regional integration that is being talked about at CARICOM Heads of Government meeting come go?
Well, one of the issues with the CARICOM meetings is that it keeps talking about the same thing each year. And therefore there is a general feeling that it's not moving as fast as it should. Much has been achieved over the last 30 years. In terms of creating a single market in the economy, and a lot may have been achieved in terms of a slow movement towards the movement of people and the movement in the flow of goods. What is probably required is now, especially in light of the changing economic situation in the region, a new trust and energy policy that will be able to provide a sense of confidence to the people that energy will not become a main risk factors for the region. And with what's happened in Guyana, I think the situation is quite open now for a new look at that particular issue.
I mean, let's talk a little bit about the CARICOM leadership at the moment. It looks united, has been united in its common messaging for certain international and regional issues. Let's just take one, for example. Let's just take the Israel-Palestine conflict, Hamas conflict at the moment. That's one example. Let's take another one, climate change. The issue of climate change. CARICOM has spoken out as one voice. Regional security, it has spoken out with a common voice with the United States. Is CARICOM leadership now more on the same page now than perhaps when you were Minister of Foreign Affairs?
I don't think it has changed very much. I think making statements that are relevant to the global crisis that emerge has always been one of the hallmark of Caribbean diplomacy. I think Caribbean diplomacy is highly respected beyond our shores for that very reason. But what is required now is how do you convert that into development, and how do you convert that into actual change in the country's national interests being served.
So right now you feel that it's just one common voice, but the voice isn't actually being heard, or at least...
It's not loud enough, not deep enough, and not wide enough.
How do they fix that? How does the region fix that?
You can't fix that in any one particular initiative, but you got to recognize, first of all, what are the areas to be fixed globally, regionally, and internationally.
One of the challenges that we face, Mr. Dookeran, is that there is still a lot of challenges intra-regionally. And these are challenges that date back even before you were Minister of Foreign Affairs. Sure. Let's talk a little bit about travel. You know, traveling across the islands. We would love to be a Caribbean community in the real community sense of the word, but the reality is traveling to different islands is still very much a challenge. And then now there are diplomatic issues that will challenge the foreign affairs ministries of most islands. Let's just take, for example, what is happening between Guyana and Venezuela at the moment will challenge the diplomacy and, of Trinidad and Tobago. You see where I'm going with this?
There are some missing institutions. For instance, there was talk once in the aftermath of the Federation that there should be a Caribbean Parliament that can meet at the political level in order to handle some of these issues and not be left to the bureaucrats at the level of the CARICOM Secretariat or other institutions of that nature. That is a proposal I think is worth revisiting.
And I'm smiling because I wonder how is that going to work in a Caribbean region. How do you select the parliamentarians? Who leads the parliament?
Well, those are the issues that will have to be resolved. But the idea is there should be more intense dialogue on issues that are common to the Caribbean, so it will have a stronger voice.
Because on the
I think the Association of Caribbean States is really the only institution in the Caribbean that is really of the Caribbean and of a global nature. And it should be given a stronger role to play in the conduct of foreign policy.
Coming up, the Caribbean at a crossroads. Change or risk remaining the same.
If we fail to do it, what are the consequences? Sat in the Foreign Affairs Ministry office of Trinidad and Tobago and represented this country at the CARICOM level and the international level, you, Mr. Winston Dookeran, have confidence in Caribbean leadership that it can execute something like a Caribbean Parliament.
Of course. The question,
there are basic things that we can't get.
And that's why the book. That's why, if I can bring you back to the book, this is what the book does. It's resetting Caribbean policy in the context of the aftermath. One such policy has to do with Caribbean diplomacy and what are the institutions that should be put into place. Not that what has happened is wrong or is inadequate. In the context of the time, it was perhaps what was possible. But now that you have to look ahead, and especially with the multipolar world in which we are living, there is need to become more sensitive to those issues. But not only in that respect, in respect of the national policies. We are facing major issues that has to be addressed by changing our institutional focus. The book is about how do you change the institutional focus, how do you change the policy direction of many of our institutions that have served us well in the first period after independence, but we are at a point that there's need to change. Now, to start such a change, you need to do the research and you need to do the policy analysis. and then you will get the particular directions to move.
How critical is that change as we head into the next 50 years of
Oh,
CARICOM?
very critical. It's absolutely no doubt. That's why I took the effort to bring all these scholars together.
Understood.
In order to do this book.
I'll push you a little bit further. If we fail to do it, what are the consequences?
Well, the consequences will be that we would have lost another opportunity in order to be able to provide for our people what are the basic goods that must be provided.
Well, more than a lost opportunity, do you not see it as something that could have serious impact on the human lives of the Caribbean, the human capital of the Caribbean?
Well, of course it will. But that's what the whole idea of policy analysis. Policy analysis is the first step in the process of change.
You keep repeating policy analysis, and it's a very technical term. Is that where we have not done enough in the region?
We have to move ahead of the curve now, not behind the curve. And in that sense, we need to move towards what is likely to be the challenges ahead of us and be able to respond to that.
All right. I also want to talk to you as a former Foreign Affairs Minister. It's very important to get your thoughts on what is happening around the CARICOM region at the moment. I just mentioned to you the Venezuela-Guyana border dispute that continues to make its way into the headlines. Trinidad and Tobago has a vested interest in both Venezuela, obviously with the ongoing deal with the Dragon gas field, as well as Guyana as a CARICOM partner and a food security partner. How precarious is this position for this nation to be in at this moment?
I won't call it precarious, but I think it's a situation that lends itself to a clear set of policies to try and resolve the issue of the border dispute. Caribbean countries have always supported the Guyana request and have never agreed with the Venezuelan position on the matter. When I was foreign minister, we did some what we call backroom work on that issue with both countries. It's deep-seated, but it's erupting again. And perhaps because of the new oil situation in Guyana, is likely to become even more precarious. But that has a geopolitical perspective to it. And therefore we cannot ignore it in the sense of just seeing it as that's something that is there, because there are some geopolitical factors. Now that we have another conflict taking place in the Middle East, we could see already that we cannot be immune to global conflicts that are happening elsewhere, because right on our doorsteps, we have one that could erupt to a great extent.
If you were Minister of Foreign Affairs today, what would be your position on it?
Well, I think what will be required is to do some backroom work to try and get both parties together rather than have them in a confrontational position in which they appear to be at this point in time, where one country wants to have a referendum on the issue and the other country is saying that they'll rely on the international court for a decision, and therefore you need some deep dialogue there.
And I'm going to go back to the question. You would stand on the line and you would mediate, almost, to lack of a better word, mediate between Guyana and Venezuela, given that Trinidad and Tobago has vested interests in both parties.
And given that this can be a situation that could explode beyond our region because of the global dimensions to it.
Very quickly, I know that we're running out of time. You are also a finance minister. You held many portfolios, you have to forgive me. A finance minister in Trinidad and Tobago. Are you satisfied with the way the economy has been handled and ultimately rebounded post-pandemic?
I think a lot positives have happened, and I think the economy has stabilized, and I think the Minister of Finance have been able to balance the books. But I have argued to him and to others that he does not take enough risk to put the economy on a growth path. And to do that, this book deals with that issue as well. How do you create a new growth path by which you can move forward?
Just in the interest of our
moving
viewers
ahead
and
of
time.
the head of the curve is what I'm concerned about.
Right, just what are those risks that you wish to see, just for the benefit of our viewing public?
Well, there are two big issues really. One is the issues of inequality in the country, and the other one is the issues of growth. And while we deal with the issues of balance in the books, we don't really have a very positive approach to dealing with inequality. And in that sense, the institutions that serve the distribution of wealth needs to be addressed.
Any more questions, Mr. Dookeran? And I think I would have read out the entire book for our public, and I will let them read it for themselves instead of spelling out all of the words for it. But I do appreciate you taking the time out to talk to us about Resetting Caribbean Policy Analysis in the Aftermath of the COVID-19 Pandemic. It is available on Amazon.com. Edited by Mr. Winston Dookeran, also co-authored 9 chapters of it. Mr. Winston Dookeran, thank you very much.
Before you go on, I just want to say that anyone can come to the launch of the book, which will be at the Central Bank on the 14th. And I hope that they do take the opportunity to come and hear some more details on what is contained in the book.
Mr. Winston Dookeran, thank you very much for being on the program.
Thank you.